Emotional blackmail is not loud. It does not announce itself with threats shouted across a room or ultimatums carved in stone. It comes quietly, like smoke slipping under the door, filling the space before you notice it has arrived. A manipulator does not need chains or cages. Their weapon is far more subtle. They learn the contours of your fears, the delicate points of your longing, the insecurities you try to hide, and they hold them like cards in a deck, ready to play them against you. They do not have to raise their voice or strike you with force. Instead, they create an atmosphere where you begin to fear what might be taken from you: love, approval, peace, connection. And that fear makes you bend. The silent threat is not what they say, but what they imply. If you do not give in, if you do not comply, something you value will vanish. Perhaps it is their affection. Perhaps it is your stability. Perhaps it is the fragile harmony you cling to because you dread conflict. The manipulator thrives in that tension. They know that silence itself can carry more weight than words, and they exploit that weight until it crushes your resolve. Imagine standing in front of someone you care about deeply, someone whose opinion of you feels like oxygen, and suddenly realizing that every word you speak, every action you take, is being measured against an invisible scale you did not build. You feel it in the way they sigh when disappointed, in the way they withdraw when displeased, in the way they let silence linger until you are the one who breaks, apologizing for things you should never apologize for. You begin to sense a shadow hanging over you, but you cannot name it. That is the genius of emotional blackmail. It thrives in the shadows of the unspoken, making you police yourself long before they have to enforce anything. The danger of emotional blackmail lies not in what is spoken directly, but in the dread of what lingers unsaid. When someone raises a hand in anger, the threat is obvious, the boundaries are clear, and even though the violence is devastating, the act itself is visible. But emotional blackmail operates in the invisible, and that is why it is so corrosive. The manipulator crafts an environment where you begin to anticipate their reactions before they are ever voiced. You become hyper-aware of their moods, scanning their tone, their expressions, their silences for hidden meaning. This vigilance turns into a kind of imprisonment, where your inner world is dictated by the possibility of their displeasure. If they frown, you rush to explain. If they sigh, you feel responsible. If they withdraw affection, you scramble to restore balance. Every action you take becomes an attempt to prevent the punishment you fear, even if that punishment is never directly named. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop living by your own compass. You begin to revolve around theirs, adjusting, shrinking, contorting, all to avoid the crushing weight of their disappointment. The manipulator never has to say, "You must obey me." Instead, they let you draw that conclusion yourself, until obedience feels like survival and resistance feels like betrayal. And here is the cruel paradox. You start believing that keeping them happy is proof of love, that sacrificing yourself is evidence of loyalty, that swallowing your truth is what a good partner, a good child, a good friend should do. But beneath those illusions is the truth, that you are being conditioned to betray yourself, piece by piece, until self-abandonment feels normal. This is how the silent threat becomes the architecture of control. It is not built with bricks of commands or walls of rules. It is constructed from whispers, glances, and absences, until the fear of losing them shapes every choice you make. What makes the silent threat so insidious is that it rarely feels like a threat at all. It disguises itself as love, as care, as concern for your well-being. The manipulator may tell you that they only want what is best for you, that they only withdraw because they are hurt, that your choices wound them in ways you could never understand. And because you care, because your heart is not cold, because you want to preserve connection, you take their words at face value. You begin to believe that your freedom endangers them, that your independence is selfish, that your happiness must always be weighed against their comfort. In this way, the blackmailer does not need to raise their voice, for your own guilt becomes the enforcer of their demands. Every time you consider stepping away, you hear the echo of their sadness. Every time you imagine saying no, you see the image of their disappointment. Every time you try to speak your truth, you feel the heavy weight of responsibility for how they might react. And so, you silence yourself. You bend. You shrink. You surrender, not because they shouted at you, but because they convinced you that withholding your obedience is the same as inflicting pain. This is the ultimate trick of the silent threat. It convinces you that you are not being coerced at all, but rather choosing, willingly, to sacrifice yourself for love. Yet deep down, in the quietest part of your soul, you feel the fracture. You sense that something sacred is being eroded, that the person you once were is dissolving into someone who tiptoes through life, forever afraid of stepping on the wrong edge. The manipulator thrives in that erosion, feeding on your silence, feeding on your fear, feeding on the loyalty you bleed out in hopes of peace. But peace never comes. Only compliance, only exhaustion, only the hollow echo of a self that once burned brighter before the shadow of another began to dim it. Fear is the bloodstream of manipulation, the unseen current that keeps the victim tethered to the manipulator's will. It is not the kind of fear you feel when a predator leaps from the shadows or when a weapon is pressed against your skin. It is quieter, subtler, and far more enduring. This fear is born not from the threat of physical harm, but from the terror of loss. Loss of love, loss of safety, loss of belonging. A manipulator studies the cracks in your armor, the insecurities you hide, the anxieties that gnaw at you in silence. They learn where you are most fragile, and then they place themselves at the center of that fragility, so that the possibility of losing them, disappointing them, or angering them feels like the end of stability itself. Fear becomes the price you pay to keep the relationship intact, and you begin to live like a debtor, constantly making payments to avoid the looming cost of their withdrawal. In this economy of control, every sigh, every silence, every subtle withdrawal of warmth is a coin collected from your soul. The manipulator does not need to scream or strike. They simply allow your imagination to fill in the blanks, and imagination is often more cruel than reality. You picture abandonment, rejection, or conflict, and the image alone is enough to paralyze you into obedience. The most effective chains are not made of iron but of dread, because dread makes you guard the lock yourself. That is how the manipulator wins, not by openly enslaving you, but by convincing you that rebellion will cost more than submission. And so, you learn to pay the toll. You trade your voice for quiet, your boundaries for calm, your truth for the illusion of harmony. Fear is the manipulator's currency, and they spend it lavishly, knowing that as long as you believe the cost of defiance is unbearable, you will continue to fund their power with the coin of your own silence. The genius of using fear as leverage is that it does not have to be logical. It only has to feel real to the one being controlled. A manipulator does not need to prove that abandonment is certain, only that it is possible. They do not need to say they will leave, only to let their silence stretch long enough for your heart to race with the thought of being discarded. They do not need to declare war, only to create the suggestion that conflict is inevitable if you resist. And because human beings are wired to avoid pain and cling to connection, you begin to shape your behavior around the avoidance of imagined catastrophe. Fear becomes the lens through which you see the relationship, and every decision is filtered through the question, what will happen if I say no? What will happen if I stand firm? What will happen if I speak my truth? The manipulator relies on your inability to face those imagined outcomes, because the human mind often prefers captivity with company to freedom with loneliness. This is why fear works so effectively. It creates a prison without walls, where you sit inside the cell though the door has never been locked. You may even convince yourself that you are safe, that staying silent is the wiser choice, that avoiding conflict is evidence of maturity, when in truth it is fear guiding every move you make. And here lies the terrible irony. The longer you comply out of fear, the more the manipulator senses your weakness, and the more boldly they exploit it. Fear is a currency that does not devalue over time. It compounds. Each concession adds interest. Each surrender increases the debt, until the mere thought of defiance feels catastrophic. The manipulator becomes both the creditor and the executioner, holding your dread in their hands like a weapon sharpened by your own imagination. This is not love. It is not care. It is a transaction where the price you pay is your autonomy, and the payment is extracted through the unrelenting terror of loss. What makes fear such a devastating instrument is that it slowly reshapes the very definition of love, care, and loyalty in the mind of the victim. You begin to confuse submission with devotion, obedience with harmony, silence with peace. The manipulator teaches you that if you truly care for them, you will avoid anything that upsets them, that you will place their comfort above your own needs, that you will accept the cost of sacrifice without complaint. Fear becomes the invisible teacher, rewriting the rules of intimacy until suffering feels like proof of affection. And yet beneath this twisted arrangement lies a brutal truth. Love that is sustained by fear is not love at all, but dependency masquerading as virtue. You do not stay because you are cherished. You stay because you are afraid of what leaving would unleash. This is how the manipulator transforms your own heart into their greatest ally. They do not have to build the cage. You build it yourself, plank by plank, nail by nail, with every anxious concession, with every attempt to avoid their withdrawal. And while you believe you are protecting the relationship, you are in fact eroding the very foundation of who you are. Fear steals not only your freedom but your clarity, because it convinces you that survival is more important than authenticity. You may tell yourself that one day things will balance, that the fear will fade if you just endure long enough. But fear never fades when it is used as currency. It only grows more expensive. Each year, each compromise, each silence adds to the debt until one day you discover that you are bankrupt of self. And when you reach that moment, the manipulator no longer needs to exert effort at all, because fear has done its work. It has hollowed you out and convinced you that without them, you will collapse. But here is the truth they never want you to see. Fear only has power when you accept its terms of exchange. If fear is the currency of manipulation, then guilt is the leash that keeps the victim tethered long after the initial threat has been made. It is not enough for the manipulator to frighten you into silence. They also need to convince you that compliance is your moral duty. Guilt is the perfect weapon for this purpose because it disguises control as responsibility. The manipulator will suggest, directly or indirectly, that their suffering is your fault, that their sadness is the result of your neglect, that their anger is triggered by your mistakes, that their emptiness is proof of your failure to love them enough. And because guilt is one of the deepest, most corrosive emotions, you absorb these accusations until you no longer know where their responsibility ends and yours begins. You begin to believe that you are the caretaker of their happiness, that if you do not yield to their wishes, you are cruel, selfish, ungrateful. Every moment of resistance is reframed as betrayal, every attempt at independence cast as abandonment. Guilt becomes the leash wrapped tightly around your throat, pulling you back each time you try to walk away. You may tell yourself that enduring their demands is noble, that sacrifice is the price of love, that bending yourself out of shape is what it means to be loyal. But these are illusions, carefully planted to make you complicit in your own captivity. The manipulator thrives when you confuse your self-erasure with virtue. The more you apologize, the more you submit, the more they tighten the leash, rewarding your obedience with temporary relief, punishing your defiance with waves of shame. And soon, you are no longer responding to who they are, but to the shadow of guilt they have cast inside you. You are not living for yourself, but for the constant, gnawing need to avoid feeling like a villain in a story they have authored. The brilliance of guilt as a tool of control is that it turns your own conscience into their enforcer. Unlike fear, which makes you anticipate external punishment, guilt corrodes you from within. You replay their accusations in your mind long after the argument has ended, long after the silence has fallen, long after they have gone to sleep. The manipulator does not even need to be present for their power to operate, because you begin to police yourself. Each time you think about setting a boundary, a voice rises inside you, whispering that you are being selfish. Each time you imagine pursuing your own joy, the echo of their disappointment surfaces, telling you that your happiness is bought at their expense. And slowly, guilt becomes a shadow that follows you everywhere. It weighs down your choices, colors your perception, and rewrites the meaning of love itself. Love becomes not about mutual growth or shared respect, but about constant sacrifice and endless apology. You start to believe that the measure of your care is how much pain you are willing to endure in silence, how much of yourself you are willing to give up, how many times you are willing to apologize for simply existing. And because guilt carries the illusion of morality, you mistake submission for virtue. You tell yourself that you are doing the right thing by keeping them calm, by avoiding conflict, by holding the relationship together at any cost. But beneath that illusion is a devastating reality. The more you yield, the more they demand. Each act of surrender is not a resolution, but an invitation for deeper control. Guilt is addictive to the manipulator because every time you buckle under its weight, they are reminded of their ability to reshape your identity. They do not need chains when you willingly bind yourself with shame. They do not need to shout when you are already whispering apologies for crimes you did not commit. The most dangerous aspect of guilt is not only that it keeps you tethered, but that it convinces you you are tethered for noble reasons. When the leash of guilt tightens, you may even feel proud of your suffering, as if your endless sacrifice is proof of your strength or kindness. The manipulator exploits this distortion relentlessly. They position themselves as the wounded party, the fragile soul who depends on your constant caretaking, the one who would collapse without your devotion. And you, desperate not to feel like a monster, keep giving, keep bending, keep apologizing for injuries you did not inflict. Over time, guilt rewires your identity. You no longer ask, "What do I want?" or what is right for me. Instead, every thought is filtered through the question, how will this affect them? Will they be disappointed? Will they think I am selfish? This erosion is subtle, but it is absolute. Piece by piece, the person you were begins to dissolve, replaced by a version of yourself that exists only to ease their suffering, or rather, the suffering they claim to have, the suffering they wield like a weapon. And here lies the cruelest irony. The more you try to heal them, the more broken you become. The more you attempt to protect them from pain, the more pain you swallow in silence. You become both prisoner and guard, chained by guilt, yet clinging to it as if it were a mark of virtue. But guilt is not virtue. It is a leash, one that pulls tighter each time you mistake obedience for love. The manipulator knows this. They know that as long as you feel responsible for their emotions, you will never cut the rope. They know that as long as you carry their pain as your burden, they can walk freely while you drag the weight. To break free requires something terrifying, the willingness to see guilt for what it is, not as a moral compass, but as a weapon sharpened against you. Control, when executed through emotion, does not operate as a single act, but as a repeating cycle, an unbroken loop that spins faster the longer you remain caught inside it. The manipulator understands that power must be maintained, not through one dramatic blow, but through a rhythm that wears you down over time. The pattern is deceptively simple: demand, resistance, punishment, surrender, relief, repeat. At first, you may not even recognize it. A demand is made, perhaps small, perhaps framed as reasonable, perhaps delivered with the tone of someone who claims to know what is best for you. You resist, even slightly, trying to assert your independence, trying to hold on to your right to choose. That resistance is met with punishment. It may come as anger, as cold withdrawal, as guilt-inducing words, or as silence that hangs like a storm about to break. The punishment stirs fear and guilt, the twin levers that bend your will. You surrender. You give in, not because the demand was just, but because the punishment has made resistance unbearable. In that surrender, you feel a fleeting relief. The storm has passed, the silence is broken, the anger has softened, the world feels safe again. But that relief is temporary, for the cycle does not end. Another demand will come, followed by resistance, punishment, and surrender once more. And with each turn of the cycle, your resistance grows weaker, your surrender comes faster, your boundaries fade further into the background. This cycle is the hidden machinery of control, a loop so well designed that it convinces you obedience is the only path to peace. And the most terrifying part is this: the manipulator does not even need to enforce it forever. Once the cycle is ingrained, you begin to enforce it on yourself, anticipating the demand, skipping resistance, moving straight to surrender to avoid the punishment you now expect as inevitable. The cycle's cruelty is that it trains you to anticipate pain and seek the smallest reprieve, teaching your nervous system to prefer the comfort of predictability over the risk of truth. Each time you capitulate, the pattern tightens its grip a little more. You begin to learn the choreography, how their jaw tightens before a withdrawal, how their eyes go distant before a rebuke, how a certain tone of voice will carve the shape of your apology. You become an expert at preemption, at softening yourself before the blow lands, at trimming your words and desires so they do not irritate the fragile equilibrium you have been taught to protect. This preemptive shrinking creates a dangerous illusion. You start to believe that peace is born from silence, and that safety is earned by giving up pieces of yourself. The manipulator, in turn, rewards those concessions with intermittent kindness, small mercies that appear like sunlight between storm clouds, an apology, a warm smile, a tender phrase that momentarily convinces you that you did the right thing. Those moments are addictive. They function as the cycle's grease, making the loop easier to spin and more comfortable to inhabit. You come to crave those brief returns to warmth, and so you pay the price they demand without questioning its fairness. The cycle also teaches you to distrust your own memory and perception. When you push back, you may be met with stupefying claims that your recollection is faulty, that you are hypersensitive, that you are deliberately trying to hurt them. Gaslight by narrative and emotion, you begin to doubt your instincts and reinterpret your boundaries as unreasonable. The punishment for resistance is not only the withdrawal you feared, but the slow erosion of your confidence, until even the idea of standing firm seems like a foolish fantasy. And yet the pattern is not purely mechanical. It is theatrical. What makes the cycle so devastating is not only its repetition, but its disguise as something normal, even inevitable. Relationships always have ups and downs, you remind yourself. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone gets angry sometimes. And so you reinterpret the punishments and reconciliations as just part of love's storm, unaware that this is not the natural weather of connection, but a climate engineered with precision. The manipulator knows that if they can keep you oscillating between fear and relief, you will never have the stillness required to see clearly. They rely on exhaustion, on the gradual dulling of your critical faculties, until questioning the cycle feels harder than surrendering to it. The longer it continues, the more it rewires your sense of identity. You no longer measure yourself against your own values, but against their moods. A good day is not one where you acted with integrity, but one where you avoided their wrath. This inversion of meaning is the heart of the cycle's power. It turns survival into success, compliance into virtue. Slowly, the walls of possibility shrink. Choices you once believed were yours, what to say, what to want, what to hope for, become invisible. The manipulator's shadow stretches over every decision, even when they are not in the room, because you have been taught to anticipate their reaction before you act. And in that anticipation, you become your own jailer. You silence yourself before they do. You compromise before they demand it. You abandon dreams before they can mock them. In time, their control becomes less about direct pressure and more about the invisible leash you now carry inside you. The cycle, once external, becomes internal law. And the tragedy of this law is how it disguises itself as care, as compromise, as the necessary cost of keeping love intact. But it is not love. It is dependence masquerading as devotion. The price of compliance is rarely calculated in the moment, because in the moment, surrender feels cheaper than resistance. When someone weaponizes your emotions, when they lace their affection with threats of abandonment or drape their silence like a shroud over your existence, it is easier to bend than to break. You tell yourself it is only one compromise, one apology you do not mean, one desire you will set aside for the sake of peace. But emotional submission is never a single act. It becomes a rhythm, a posture, a way of inhabiting the relationship. With each concession, a fragment of your selfhood is chipped away. You silence a truth, abandon a need, betray a value, all in the desperate hope that harmony will return. Yet harmony never truly arrives, because the manipulator does not want equality, they want control. And control is fed by your willingness to keep erasing yourself. At first, the losses seem small, almost invisible. You skip a conversation, delay a decision, swallow an objection. But over time, those small sacrifices accumulate, layering upon one another until you cannot remember the last time you acted from unfiltered desire. You begin to distrust your own instincts, because they always seem to invite conflict. The leash tightens not only in the manipulator's hands, but in your own mind. You learn to anticipate their reactions, and in that anticipation, you censor yourself before a word is spoken. Compliance becomes a reflex, and reflex hardens into identity. You start to believe you are someone who must always keep the peace, someone whose worth is measured by how well they avoid upsetting others. This internal redefinition is the hidden tax of emotional blackmail. You are not only manipulated, you are rewritten. And the new script is one where your value exists only in how much of yourself you are willing to abandon. The tragedy lies in how familiar this script becomes, until obedience no longer feels like loss, but like love itself. Compliance is seductive because it offers the illusion of safety, but that safety is fragile, conditional, and always at risk of being revoked. When you submit to emotional pressure, you temporarily quiet the storm, yet storms do not vanish. They wait, gathering power for the next strike. Each time you yield, you train both yourself and the manipulator. You teach yourself that resistance brings unbearable pain, and you teach them that your boundaries are negotiable, dissolvable under the weight of guilt or fear. This exchange becomes the hidden contract of control, one you never signed but live by daily. The manipulator learns how to tug at the strings, when to evoke guilt, when to hint at abandonment, when to withhold affection like oxygen until you are gasping for relief. You, in turn, learn to predict these cues, reshaping your choices not according to your own values, but according to their moods. Slowly, you give up the right to disappoint, the right to anger, the right to say no. The currency you spend is not money or possessions, but pieces of your own soul, traded for temporary calm. The worst part is that compliance disguises itself as kindness, as love, as compromise. You tell yourself you are protecting the relationship, keeping it intact, proving your devotion. But what you are really doing is financing your own diminishment, investing in a bond that feeds on your silence and thrives on your submission. And the more you pay, the less you have left to protect. Dreams once vivid fade into shadows because they require too much risk, too much honesty, too much space that the manipulator will not allow. Friendships wither because they draw suspicion or provoke jealousy. Even your private thoughts become suspect, patrolled by an inner guard that whispers warnings. Do not think too loudly. Do not want too deeply. Do not remember who you were. The cruelest truth about compliance is that it does not buy what it promises. You imagine that by yielding, you will secure love, loyalty, or lasting peace, but what you actually secure is dependency, a tether that grows tighter with each act of surrender. The manipulator does not respect your compliance. They exploit it. Each concession confirms to them that their methods work, that fear and guilt are reliable levers, that your devotion is measured not by mutual respect, but by how much you are willing to lose yourself. And so the demands escalate. What began as small sacrifices, an apology you didn't owe, a silence you didn't want, a dream you tucked away, matures into larger surrenders. Choices about your future, your relationships, even the shape of your identity. You find yourself living a life curated not by your own values, but by the avoidance of someone else's disapproval. The irony is that the more you comply, the less you are seen. Your compliance does not earn recognition or gratitude. It erases you, until even you can no longer recognize the outline of the person you once were. This is the hidden theft of emotional coercion. It convinces you that disappearing is a form of love, when in reality, disappearing is the ultimate proof that love has been replaced by control. And yet, even within this bleak cycle, there is a brutal clarity waiting to be uncovered. Every moment of compliance is also a reminder of choice. Each surrender highlights the fork in the road you did not take, the moment you could have said no, the chance to reclaim what was yours. That recognition is painful. It feels like staring at the ruins of a house you helped dismantle brick by brick. But it is also the first step toward escape, because awareness cracks the illusion that you are powerless. The cost of compliance cannot be refunded, but it can be halted. The bill does not have to keep arriving. There comes a moment, often quiet and almost invisible, when the fog begins to thin. After months or years of bending, shrinking, apologizing for needs that were never sins, something inside you grows restless. It may be a fleeting thought, a memory of who you were before the chains, or a jolt of recognition when you watch someone else live without fear of constant punishment. That flicker feels dangerous, but also undeniable. It is the first sign that the spell of emotional coercion can be broken. The manipulator has built their power on enchantment, on convincing you that guilt is loyalty, that fear is love, that compliance is survival. To question this feels like heresy, like pulling at the seams of a world they worked tirelessly to stitch around you. Yet every spell, no matter how carefully woven, is vulnerable once you learn its language. Naming the pattern strips it of its sacred disguise. The realization that this is not love, this is control, can be as jarring as waking from a dream, but it is the first step toward reclaiming your mind. This awakening is not dramatic in the way stories portray escape. It is fragile, trembling, like a candle flame shielded against the wind. The manipulator senses it, too. They will notice when your eyes no longer bow as quickly, when your silences grow heavier with defiance rather than submission. Their response is predictable. They will tighten the leash, amplify the guilt, raise the stakes of abandonment. They will remind you of everything you stand to lose if you step out of line. But the truth that flickers inside you is stronger than their threats, because it reveals something you had forgotten. You do not need their approval to exist. You existed before them. You will exist after them. And this recognition, however small, begins to dissolve the spell's hold. Breaking free from the machinery of emotional coercion is not an act of sudden rebellion, but of gradual reclamation, a process that unfolds in layers as you begin to separate what is yours from what has been forced upon you. At first, the act of questioning feels unbearable because it threatens the fragile balance that has defined your world. You have been conditioned to believe that the manipulator's displeasure is a catastrophe, that even the smallest deviation from obedience will summon chaos. This is the illusion that keeps the spell intact, the belief that you are powerless without their approval. To challenge that belief requires more than courage. It requires endurance. You must endure the storms they unleash when you stop bending. You must endure the guilt that has been programmed into you, guilt that whispers you are selfish, ungrateful, cruel. And you must endure the silence that follows when their affection is withdrawn, a silence designed to remind you of your supposed dependence. Yet endurance is precisely where the spell begins to unravel. With every act of resistance, however small, you discover that the world does not end when you say no. The threats that once felt apocalyptic are revealed to be smoke and mirrors, intimidation without substance. The manipulator's rage burns hot, but it burns out. Their punishments sting, but they do not define you. What defines you is the quiet realization that you can withstand it. This discovery reshapes your identity piece by piece. You begin to see that compliance was never about keeping peace, but about sustaining their dominance. You realize that the silence you carried was not kindness, but captivity. Each recognition pulls another thread from the fabric of the spell until it begins to collapse under its own weight. And in its collapse, you find both grief and liberation. Grief for the years you lost to someone else's script, and liberation in the knowledge that you can write a new one. The final stage of breaking the spell is not just leaving the manipulator's orbit, but reclaiming the parts of yourself you had been taught to bury. Escape without reclamation leaves ghosts behind, fragments of guilt, habits of silence, reflexes of fear that can haunt even after the chains are gone. To truly sever the enchantment, you must confront the internalized voice that still whispers their judgments, the echo of their control that lingers like smoke in the walls of your mind. This is the hardest work, because it requires you to admit how deeply the spell reached, how thoroughly it rewrote your sense of worth. Yet it is also the most necessary, because without that confrontation, you remain vulnerable to the same weapon in different hands. Breaking the spell means refusing to let guilt dictate your choices, refusing to let fear masquerade as loyalty, refusing to accept that love must be earned through erasure. It means standing in the raw discomfort of selfhood, learning to speak desires without apology, to draw boundaries without trembling, to endure disapproval without collapsing. These acts feel unnatural at first, because you have lived so long in their absence, but they are the rituals of rebirth. And slowly, what once felt like defiance begins to feel like truth. The manipulator's shadow fades, not because they disappear, but because their presence no longer defines the boundaries of your life. Their threats lose their sharpness, their guilt loses its sting, their silence loses its power, because you are no longer bound by the belief that survival depends on surrender. You begin to see compliance for what it always was, not devotion, not care, but a tax on your humanity. And by refusing to pay it, you reclaim more than freedom. You reclaim the right to live without invisible strings. This is not an easy freedom, nor is it without scars. The years of silence leave marks, and the memory of chains does not vanish overnight.